When Elvis Presley was publicly humiliated by a renowned critic who declared, "Vegas has finally killed rock and roll," the arena fell silent as the king stepped to the edge of the stage. How did Elvis transform this moment of disrespect into one of the most powerful performances of his career, proving exactly why he would always be the king? The crystal chandeliers of the International Hotel's showroom dimmed one by one, plunging the 2,000 seats into a darkness thick with perfume, cigarette smoke, and anticipation. August 1970. Vegas, the desert air outside remained scorching even at this late hour, but inside, the atmosphere crackled with its own electric heat. Waiters in crisp uniforms maneuvered between tables where Hollywood celebrities clinked ice in whiskey glasses, beside vacationing Midwesterners who'd saved all year for this pilgrimage. In the third row center sat Harold Maslin, music critic for the Los Angeles Times, his thin lips pressed into a judgmental line beneath horn-rimmed glasses. 3 months earlier, his review of Elvis's album had cut deep, a cultural fossil attempting to excavate relevance from the rubble of his former glory. Maslin tapped his silver pen against a small notebook, ready to document another milestone in what he considered the inevitable decline of rock and roll's first king. The orchestra struck its opening notes, brassy, bold, and unmistakable. A spotlight carved through the darkness, finding empty space at center stage as the announcer's voice boomed. "Ladies and gentlemen, the International Hotel is proud to present the one, the only, Elvis Presley." The crowd surged to its feet in a tidal wave of movement, the roar deafening as Elvis emerged from behind the curtain in a white jumpsuit, with subtle gold embellishments catching the light like constellations. At 35, his face had filled out from the dangerous beauty of his youth, but when he smiled that half-smile that had launched 1,000 imitations, the years fell away. "Thank you very much," Elvis drawled into the microphone, his Mississippi roots still evident beneath Vegas polish. "It's good to be back." His eyes, lined now with the weight of experience, scanned the audience with practiced ease before catching, just for a moment, on Maslin's unmoved expression. Something flickered across Elvis's face, a momentary break in the professional veneer, before he nodded to the conductor and launched into C.C. Rider. The band was tight, professional, expensive 20-piece orchestra, gospel quartet backup, percussion that made the chandeliers tremble. Elvis moved with deliberate showmanship, each gesture calculated for maximum impact. Yet in the spaces between choreographed movements, watchful eyes might catch something else, a weariness in his shoulders, a mechanical quality to the hip swivels that had once scandalized a nation. When he reached for a high note in Proud Mary, his voice strained slightly against its limits, recovering quickly but not before Maslin scribbled something in his notebook and leaned to whisper to his companion. 3 songs in, Elvis paused to wipe his brow with a silk scarf, then tossed it to a woman in the front row who clutched it to her chest, mascara-streaked tears already tracking down her cheeks. As he turned back to the microphone, his gaze again found Maslin, who made no effort to hide his smirk of disapproval. The critic's companion, a younger reporter clearly there for training, nodded seriously at whatever cutting observation Maslin had shared. Elvis's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He adjusted his stance, feet planted more firmly on the stage, as if bracing himself against an invisible current. "This next song," he said, voice dropping to a register that made the audience lean forward in their seats, "is one that means a lot to me." As the opening notes of Suspicious Minds began, the air in the room seemed to compress with possibility, everyone present sensing, though they couldn't have named it, that something extraordinary was about to unfold. 90 minutes before stepping on stage, Elvis had stood alone in his penthouse suite, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The pills from Dr. Ixter. Nick to sleep, to wake, to perform, to exist, sat in their amber bottles on the counter, a chemical scaffolding holding up the increasingly fragile architecture of his days. He'd swallowed two with a gulp of Pepsi, feeling them scratch down his throat. Outside the bathroom door, his entourage waited, his father Vernon anxiously checking his watch, backup singers warming their voices, Colonel Parker likely already downstairs, counting the sold-out house and calculating percentages. Elvis splashed cold water on his face, droplets clinging to sideburns that now required more meticulous dyeing. That morning's newspaper lay open on the marble countertop, folded to Maslin's advance piece, announcing his attendance at tonight's show. Presley's reinvention rings hollow. The headline declared, a nostalgic cash grab masquerading as artistic evolution. The words had lodged inside Elvis like shrapnel. After reading it, he'd called Priscilla back in Memphis, needing to hear her voice. But Priscilla had been distracted, 4-year-old Lisa Marie crying in the background. The conversation had been brief, stilted by growing distance, emotional and physical, neither mentioning the rumors about her acting coach that had reached him even in Vegas. "Elvis? 20 minutes, called Charlie Hodge through the door. "Be right there," Elvis replied, voice steady, despite the turbulence beneath. He straightened, pulling the jumpsuit's fabric taut, across shoulders broader than in his youth but still strong. This wasn't just another performance. It was a battleground. The '68 comeback special had been his first victory after years of Hollywood purgatory, proving he could still command attention, still matter. But critics like Maslin viewed this Vegas residency as Surrender the Rebel who'd integrated blues and country, who'd scandalized Ed Sullivan, now packaged for middle-aged tourists, between visits to the slot machines. Colonel Parker had dismissed his concerns. "They're paying to see Elvis Presley, not to watch you reinvent the wheel every night," he'd said, cigar smoke punctuating his words. "Give 'em what they want. The classics, the jumpsuits, the scarves. That's the business we're in." But what business was that, exactly? Last week, Elvis had driven alone into the desert at dawn, something he rarely did anymore, be alone. Watching the sun rise over red mountains, he'd remembered recording That's All Right at Sun Studios. The raw joy of discovery. When was the last time he'd felt that? The pills smoothed everything to the same manageable plateau, neither too high nor too low, just existing, sustainable, profitable. He emerged from the bathroom to find Lamar Fike tuning a guitar. "You okay, E? You look a million miles away." "Just thinking about Sun Studios," Elvis admitted. 17 years ago now. "Ancient history," Lamar said with a chuckle. "You've come a long way from that pink Cadillac." Had he, though? Or had he simply traveled in an enormous circle, ending up back where he'd started but with more baggage? The boy who'd walked into Sun Studios had nothing to lose. The man preparing to take the international stage had everything, and the constant fear of losing it all hummed beneath his skin like an electrical current. A knock at the suite door announced the arrival of his standard pre-show meal: burnt bacon, mashed potatoes that he merely pushed around the plate. His appetite had been unpredictable lately. The doctor had mentioned something about his liver values, but Elvis had stopped listening, focusing instead on being ready for tonight's shows. 2 performances, 2,000 people each, 4,000 judgments. "Car's ready when you are, son," Vernon said, his weathered face unable to fully hide his concern. Elvis nodded, standing and rolling his shoulders back. He could feel the individual vertebrae in his spine aligning, preparing to bear the weight of expectation. In the elevator descending to the showroom level, he closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. The critics, the Colonel, Priscilla, the pills, the exhaustion, all of it had to fall away. For the next 2 hours, there could only be the music and the connection it forged with the audience. Even if one particular audience member had already decided what he would see before the first note played, the elevator doors opened. Backstage, the orchestra was warming up, the familiar chaos of final preparations unfolding. Elvis took his place in the shadows, waiting for his cue, a single bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple despite the aggressive air conditioning. He exhaled slowly, transforming from a man with doubts into the king with the certainty of a showman. The overture began. It was time. Suspicious minds built like a gathering storm. Elvis leaning into the lyrics with increasing intensity, the temperature in the room rising with each verse. The band hit the bridge, that familiar slowdown that always drove the crowd wild, and Elvis dropped to one knee in a move that belonged more to his younger days than to the present. For a breathless moment, the gesture worked, a flash of the old magic, before his expression tightened almost imperceptibly as he rose again, a brief grimace of effort, quickly masked by professionalism. Maslin's voice cut through a momentary lull in the music, pitched just loud enough to carry to nearby tables. All flash, no substance. Vegas has finally killed rock and roll. His companion nodded sagely, as though witnessing a profound truth rather than calculated cruelty. A ripple of discomfort spread through the immediate vicinity, embarrassed glances, shifted postures, a few disapproving looks directed at the critic. Elvis faltered mid-lyric, his voice trailing off for just a beat before muscle memory carried him forward. The band continued flawlessly, covering the momentary lapse, but something had changed in Elvis's eyes, a flash of hurt quickly submerged beneath a hardening resolve. He finished the song mechanically, going through motions suddenly stripped of their meaning. The applause afterward felt uncertain, the audience sensing the disruption in the evening's carefully constructed spell. "Thank you. Thank you very much," Elvis said, the familiar phrase hollow now as he took a white towel from Charlie Hodge and wiped his face. His gaze found Maslin again, this time with deliberate focus. The critic stared back defiantly, pen poised above his notebook like a weapon. Elvis handed the microphone back to Charlie and whispered something that made the other man's eyebrows rise in surprise. Charlie started to object, but Elvis had already turned back to the audience, extending his hand for the microphone's return. The orchestra waited, suspended in uncertainty, as Elvis walked slowly to the very edge of the stage. The spotlights followed, harsh white light, emphasizing the sweat on his brow and the intensity gathering in his features. "You know," Elvis said, his voice softer than before, forcing the room into perfect silence to catch his words. "I couldn't help but overhear the gentleman in the third row." He pointed directly at Maslin, whose expression flickered between smugness and sudden discomfort at being identified. "The distinguished critic from the Los Angeles Times has an opinion he'd like to share with all of us." A murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't part of the show, wasn't the carefully choreographed Elvis experience they'd paid for. Colonel Parker emerged from the wings, face darkening as he sensed a deviation from the script, but he stopped short of intervention, perhaps recognizing that any interruption now would only make things worse. "Sir," Elvis continued, addressing Maslin directly, "I hear you have some thoughts on my performance." The critic's companion shrank in her seat, but Maslin himself straightened, clearly determined to hold his ground. "Would you care to elaborate for everyone, since you felt it important enough to share during the song?" The silence that followed was excruciating, stretched taut across the room like an overwound guitar string ready to snap. Somewhere in the back, a glass clinked against a table, the sound startling in the tension. Maslin cleared his throat, his voice carrying in the perfect acoustics of the showroom. "I simply observed that this," he gestured vaguely at the stage, "the jumpsuits, the production, is the death of what you once represented. Packaged rebellion, sanitized for Middle America's consumption." The words landed like physical blows. Several audience members gasped. A woman near the front called out, "You're wrong!" But Elvis raised a hand gently, quieting her defense. No, let's hear him out," Elvis said, his Mississippi drawl more pronounced now, either from emotion or deliberate emphasis. "What exactly did rock and roll represent to you, Mr. Maslin, since you appointed yourself its guardian?" The critic's mouth opened and closed once before he found his footing. Authenticity, danger, cultural revolution, not dinner theater for the bourgeoisie. Elvis nodded slowly, absorbing the critique. The spotlight caught the slight tremor in his hand as he pushed back a strand of hair that had fallen across his forehead. For a terrible moment, it seemed he might walk off stage entirely. The strain of recent months, the pills, the exhaustion, the constant scrutiny all visibly weighing on him at once. The backup singers exchanged worried glances. Colonel Parker took half a step forward. But then Elvis did something entirely unexpected. He smiled, not the practiced stage smile, but something more genuine, and therefore more powerful. He turned to the band and made a cutting motion with his hand. The musicians lowered their instruments, confusion evident on their faces. "Kill the backing track," Elvis instructed the sound engineer, his voice firm. Then, turning back to the audience, and specifically to Maslin, "Let's strip away the Vegas of it all then. Just for a minute. Let's get authentic." The orchestra went completely silent. The elaborate stage lighting dimmed to a single spotlight. Elvis unplugged his microphone from its stand and sat on the edge of the stage, feet dangling like a boy on a riverbank, back in Tupelo. The transformation was so abrupt, so out of character with the established pattern of his shows, that a collective breath seemed to be held throughout the entire showroom. Even Maslin leaned forward slightly, professional detachment momentarily replaced by curiosity. "The thing about authenticity," Elvis said, his voice carrying naturally now without amplification, intimate in the sudden simplicity, "is that it's not always pretty. It's not always young. It doesn't always look the way you remember it." His eyes locked with Maslin's, neither hostile nor pleading, but deeply present in a way that hadn't been evident earlier in the show. "Sometimes it gets tired. Sometimes it takes the Vegas job because that's where life led it. And sometimes," his voice dropped even lower, forcing the entire room to lean in, "sometimes it gets told it's not authentic anymore by people who never had to live it." Act 4. The silence that followed Elvis's words was different from the tense quiet of moments before. Deeper, more reverent, as though the air itself had changed composition. Maslin's face remained impassive, but his knuckles had whitened around his pen. Elvis stood slowly, the movement deliberate, and turned to gesture toward a couple in their 70s, seated at a front table. "Sir, ma'am, how long have you been married, if you don't mind me asking?" His voice carried a genuine curiosity that pierced through the stagecraft. The elderly man sat up straighter, startled at being addressed. 42 years this September," he answered, his voice wavering with age but clear with pride. 42 years, Elvis repeated, a note of wonder in his voice. "That's something. That's more impressive than anything I've done on any stage." He glanced back at Maslin briefly before continuing. "Would you share your names with us?" "Robert and Eleanor Wilson," the woman replied, her silver hair catching the light as she smiled up at Elvis. "Robert and Eleanor Wilson, married 42 years, Elvis said, as though testing the weight of their existence against his own. "I'd like to know, if it's not too personal, what's your secret? How do you keep something real for that long?" Robert Wilson cleared his throat, suddenly aware of 2,000 people waiting for his answer. "Well, Mr. Presley," he began, his Midwestern accent thick with sincerity, "you don't try to keep it the same as when you started. You let it change. Grow together instead of apart." He reached for his wife's hand on the table. "And you show up, even on the hard days, especially on the hard days." Something shifted in Elvis's expression, a recognition, perhaps, of wisdom that had eluded him in his own troubled marriage. He nodded slowly, then turned to the band. "Charlie, my guitar, please." The simple request sent a ripple of whispers through the audience. Elvis rarely played guitar in his Vegas shows, the instrument having become more prop than tool as his act evolved. Charlie brought forward an acoustic guitar, hesitating before handing it over as though uncertain this deviation from routine was wise. Colonel Parker had disappeared from the wings, presumably to contain whatever damage control might be necessary behind the scenes. Elvis settled the guitar in his hands, fingers finding familiar positions with muscle memory that transcended years and transformations. He adjusted the microphone stand and spoke directly into it, his voice stripped of performance affectation. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, this was the third song I ever recorded professionally. It's not on tonight's set list. It's not what people come to Vegas expecting from me. But it's what I wanted to be before anyone told me what I should be. His fingers strummed the opening chords of Blue Moon of Kentucky, the Bill Monroe bluegrass standard that Elvis had transformed in 1954, helping birth rock and roll in Sam Phillips' tiny recording studio. But he didn't perform it with the rockabilly urgency of that revolutionary recording. Instead, his interpretation was slower, more contemplative, the voice of a man looking back at the boy he'd been, acknowledging both the distance traveled and the unbroken thread of identity. His fingers stumbled once on the strings, a technical imperfection he neither acknowledged nor tried to hide. When he reached the chorus, the backup singers joined in softly, their gospel-trained voices adding depth rather than flash. Across the showroom, reactions transformed in waves. The elderly Wilsons beamed with the special pleasure of being singled out for connection. Younger audience members unfamiliar with this early recording leaned forward, witnessing an unexpected history lesson. And Maslin, the critic whose words had precipitated this unscripted moment, sat perfectly still, his notebook closed now, pen laid aside, the professional distance in his expression gradually replaced by something more complex: reluctant recognition. As the final notes faded, Elvis didn't wait for applause. He transitioned directly, seamlessly, into Can't Help Falling in Love, but performed with the same stripped-down honesty. The lyrics, taking on new meaning in this context, not as a closing number, but as a confession of vulnerability, of the perpetual human surrender to feelings beyond control or calculation. "Take my hand," he sang, and extended his own toward the Wilsons, who reached back instinctively, though they couldn't physically touch across the distance. The gesture itself was enough a bridge between performer and audience that transcended entertainment to touch something more fundamental. Throughout the showroom, couples reached for each other's hands in unconscious mirroring. When the song ended, the silence held for 3 full heartbeats before the applause began. Not the automatic response of an entertained crowd, but something that built gradually, authentically, into a standing ovation that seemed to surprise Elvis himself. He stood with the guitar still in his hands, sweat-dampened hair falling across his forehead, no longer the untouchable icon, but a man who had revealed himself through his art. His gaze found Maslin one final time. The critic had risen with the rest of the audience, his face unreadable, but his posture communicating what his pride perhaps could not: acknowledgement. Elvis gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning to the band and counting them into Suspicious Minds. Once more, this time with renewed purpose, the earlier interruption transformed from wound into catalyst. Later, Maslin's review would describe the show as a rare moment when the manufactured falls away, and the essential remains when Presley stopped performing Elvis, and simply was. The International would frame the review in the lobby, where it would yellow with age, but remain as testament to a night when something authentic broke through the carefully constructed surface of entertainment, and reminded everyone present why this man had changed American culture forever. As the final chord struck and Elvis left the stage, the arena lights came up on 2,000 faces, united in the knowledge that they had witnessed not just a show, but a genuine human moment, a bridge between cynicism and belief, between packaging and truth, between who we pretend to be and who we are when pretense falls away.